Hopefully everyone can see my slides.
Yep, it's all perfect.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Chantel. Okay, so again, I'm presenting on behalf of a team of a much larger research project, as you've just heard about from David, but of course, a particular aspect of this, as Glenda mentioned. So this particular research is looking at women managers and how they manage remote work teams during COVID-19. So, as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has created many challenges for private and public sector organisations in Australia as they shifted their workforces from home or to home, I should say, following government advice in 2020, as we all know. So the presentation itself will report on the working from home arrangements which impacted women managers who manage a team remotely, and focuses on the experience specifically on professional university staff, so not the academic staff that David was talking about before. And in particular, this research is looking at a group of those workers which are higher education workers levels 7 to 10. So there's just a little outline of the research that I'll talk about today, and it's providing some preliminary insights into what is happening in this particular space. Okay, so this research, we've anticipate it will contribute towards advancing knowledge and theory by gaining a deeper understanding of the manager experience of managing working from home arrangements of staff during COVID-19. So this is through gaining insights into how managerial staff manage teams through that sudden shift to working from home during the pandemic. And of course, focusing on those managers who are part of that, professional staff workforce within the higher education sector here in Australia. So I'm not looking at the Canadian data in terms of this. It's purely focused on the Australian data. And of course, research on professional staff in terms of looking at professional staff in the higher education is quite scant compared to that of looking at the academic workforce. So that was another, that's what drew me to sort of looking at this particular aspect of this project by focusing on those professional staff. This may also have relevance, of course, to other businesses and industries as well, in terms of, the sort of professional staff sort of being more like other staff members out there in other professions and organisations. Okay, so a little bit of literature here. So the literature about line managers tells us that they're caught in an intermediate space where they're responsible for monitoring and supervising subordinates and work teams, while also being monitored and supervised themselves as employees. As organisations have encountered the need to manage uncertainty, managers are at the fulcrum of what Street referred to as the uncertainties of management, as they demand flexibility of employees while simultaneously having flexibility demanded of them. They are also caught in the opposing but concurrent tendencies evident in management towards both tighter and looser supervision in terms of how the span of control over employees operates. So new tensions therefore arise for line managers in terms of the implications for the future of work and for management. The switch to working from home also places reliance on a high trust approach, but may conflict with an organisation's demand for supervision. In addition to sort of peer pressure effects that support high trust, this may also be lost when managers are not able to see the work of their subordinates, and also the employees within groups are unable to see each other's work as well. And of course, the use of monitoring through computer-based systems may not be easily deployable due to that rapid shift in terms of working from home that we experienced over the last 12 months. So managers are left to ensure that the productivity of their staff is maintained during this situation. So the literature so far then tells us that COVID-19 has highlighted that managers are at the coalface in terms of supporting teams who are also grappling with that transition to working from home. And as such, managers are not only having to adjust their own work to working from home while dealing with the directives from senior management, but they also are managing the concerns of their staff, that are now working from home, and also ensuring that productivity is maintained. There's also an element of emotional labour taken on in addition to the normal day-to-day duties, but at the same time, these managers are not equipped with the skills or the training to manage this particular change in the workplace and in work practices. This group do not normally work from home themselves and are less likely to manage subordinates, of course, who work from home under sort of normal working arrangements. So the sudden shift has also brought with it a range of challenges. Both managers themselves and their staff have encountered impacts on the separation between work and home, impacting work-life balance, especially where child caring and homeschooling are involved, and which normally has more impact upon women, as we heard before as well from David. So this led us to our question, as we're concerned about the experiences of managers managing during the pandemic, with a view to asking questions about how about their sort of own transition to working from home arrangements as an employee, and also how the change has impacted upon them in terms of managing their work teams. We also began to look at the sort of broader occupational level of manager, but we're going to look deeper at whether there are some gender differences or not in our ongoing analysis. So the research methodology, so it was a mixed methods research. You've heard about the survey from David before. As I mentioned, this was looking at purely the Australian data, so the 7 universities there, and there were 5,330 responses to that survey. As also mentioned, there were a number of free text open-ended questions at the end of the survey as well that talked about positive and negative experiences of the experiences of working from home during COVID-19. We had a look at the particular data that came through, and we wanted to identify workers in that were professional staff in that sort of level to 7 to 10 area. So this was people who were defined pretty much as in a manager role or had subordinates underneath them. We conducted a range of semi-structured interviews from people that were identified out of the survey that had put their hand up and basically said that they'd like to be contacted again for a follow-up qualitative interview study. And we were aiming for 25 to 30, but we managed to obtain 27 interviews in total, each sort of lasting between 1 to 2 hours. I found that probably the longer interviews were, and I don't know if this means anything in particular, but certainly those that were longer seemed to be the Victorian counterparts who perhaps were experiencing, quite a an exacerbated sort of lockdown period for them. So we looked at staff that managed or managers that managed staff that had a lot of student interaction. So there, of course, there was, a lot of sort of complexity there and demands on those particular groups as well. So the interviews were undertaken and they were transcribed verbatim, and those halfway through the process of us completing our analysis on that. But I do have some findings from the data here in terms of in terms of Hue workers, in terms of experiencing a range of particular issues. So if we look at the Hue 1 to 6, so these are the lower level managers lower level higher education workers compared to those that are managers 7 to 10. The Hue level 7 to 10 were more likely to experience unrealistic work expectations. And we also see here that it was higher for women when compared to male managers. In addition, compared again to the lower level Hues 1 to 6 to set the 7 to 10, managers were also more likely to report increased hours, and again, women more so than men. In addition, there was a report of increased worry amongst the group. Stress increased for women more than men, and there was greater work-life interference as well reported. They were also less likely to report increased happiness, and they weren't worried about contracting COVID-19. In addition, compared to the Hue 1 to 6, looking at this sort of during those non-work hours, sort of thinking about work. So they reported, sort of greater issues of having work on their mind as well compared to those lower level workers. This slide shows the extent which working from home occurred pre and during the COVID-19 and the preferences for working from home post the pandemic. And we can see that both women and men, in the occupation ranges would like some form of working from home arrangement that we can see there down the bottom. Okay, so onto some findings in terms of the qualitative data. So the coding that we undertook revealed both benefits and also downfalls to the group in terms of working from home. So we see here things like increased workload, increased hours. There was an emotional toll on managers who were there trying to support staff as well during their transition. But also at the same time, the managers were feeling that they had limited support themselves in trying to manage this during this time. There was also issues around trust. Managers felt like that they were a bit of a meat in the sandwich between their sort of senior managers that were managing them and also trying to manage their subordinates. And there were also indications that there was a need for some flexible working arrangements to be continued, of course, when, returning back to the workplace. Some of the benefits, of course, were reduced travel time and also cost savings associated with reduced travel time, and also people would talk about things like spending lots of money on buying coffee at the workplace and lunches and those sorts of things. Okay, so in terms of some positive responses to the open-ended survey question, so this is a general overall comment. So some of the qualitative comments or quotes detailed the benefits of working from home that encapsulates, the benefits for all of the professional staff. So this particular quote reflects the benefits experienced, such as reducing stress, reducing travel time and cost savings. Communication was also an important factor in keeping teams working together, and some felt that communication had improved within their teams as a result of working from home. There were also some negative responses in the open-ended survey questions. So the first quote reflects the negative experiences of managers coping with the change from working from home, and it felt that work-life balance had actually become worse. So, some issues there in terms of some of the downsides of that, and David talked about that before with the academic staff as well. So these particular quotes reflect how managers were managing their teams and the observations of how their teams also were coping and performing during working from home. So some more findings in terms of the qualitative data again. So the first quote here is actually from a male and shows that the issues are not exclusively female. And this quote reflects how managers were managing their teams and the observations on how their teams were coping and performing during working from home. This in particular shows the male manager juggling their own work, taking on the emotional support around their staff's issues, while also juggling their own management of their own work and their home care arrangements, such as childcare and homeschooling during the COVID lockdown. So this is interesting as it's showing that managing home-based childcare and schooling is performed by a male here, which is of course traditionally thought of as a remit of women who take on the lion's share of home care arrangements. The second quote here, I think, is really poignant and highlights the limited support that the managers experienced during the management of working from home arrangements. So from the interview data, looking at the idea around sort of trust and flexibility, this quote really shows the tension here for the managers. On the one hand, this female manager who trusts their staff is unable to provide flexibility for their subordinates due to senior management wanting to control over how and when employees are to work, even in these difficult circumstances. So in terms of the discussion, it uncovered a range of demands out there on managers, and of course issues around high trust and low trust approaches. So if there's no trust, then can providing flexibility be a possibility? So this really needs to be looked at a little bit more closely. Potentially, there's new ways of thinking around training and developing better relationships and trust between layers of management. And of course, there's a need in terms of awareness, in terms of how that affects employees. So that a better balance and approach to organisational efficiency and control is needed. And this is particularly against a backdrop of professional staff wanting more flexibility to work from home, as well as managers, but senior managers seem not to be as so supportive. So we have a brief snapshot of how managers coped with the move to managing teams remotely, the lack of training, but also the demand of them and the emotional labour that they experienced. So while perhaps having to support their own subordinates, there is a feeling as well that the managers themselves were not supported during this time. There were some issues there that sort of came, some preliminary sort of things coming out of that data. The other thing that also came to mind in looking at this data was maybe that we need to have some rethinking around the notion of the ideal worker from Joan Acker, of someone who is unencumbered, but placing, in terms of unencumbered, in terms of what we think of as the ideal worker in the workplace. But of course, this kind of shifted into the home where people aren't necessarily unencumbered, both women and men. have some demands on them in terms of, household duties, childcare, and so on. So perhaps there is a rethinking of this notion of the ideal worker in the post-pandemic world. Okay, so some lessons learned from these preliminary insights, policy and practices around sudden change and what to do. Um, that contingency planning needs some development there, and training for managers is needed to help with those times when there is that sudden change that occurs. Trust appeared to be quite a big problem, with some senior managers wanting daily logs submitted of all activities by their employees, by their subordinates. There is a need for policy to be considered around more flexible working arrangements, and I think that's starting to work out there. And of course, thinking about the equity in terms of the provision of working from home available to all staff at the university, that's of course workable within normal operations of the organisation, department, or at that unit level. It could be a benefit in terms of balancing work-life balance and change or childcare arrangements, in terms of having the opportunity to have more working from home arrangements post the COVID-19 pandemic. It perhaps can also provide opportunities for better productivity and performance. So this would need to be closely looked at. And also issues around ensuring that high levels of trust, that there's that culture there in terms of high levels of trust between employees and senior management occur as well. And of course, the other benefits as a result of moving to more sustained, I guess, working from home practices post COVID-19, of course, are those things around reduction of travel time, implications for reduced greenhouse emissions, reduction in travel expenses, and perhaps even reducing things like landfill of disposable coffee cups and those sorts of things. So I guess there's a shift needed in terms of the way organisations should be looking more closely at working from home arrangements and the benefits it can bring. So the research has important implications therefore concerning policy and practices that may improve work-life balance and wellbeing arrangements for professional university staff, and how this is managed by managers post the pandemic. So I'll just leave that there. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take